This time Sark, and in this video we are looking at the strengths and weaknesses of both the USA and North Vietnam. But this all starts with the Battle of Ia Drang Valley. And in November 1965, the first significant engagement between the US and the North Vietnamese took place at the Ia Drang Valley. And the US suffered 300 deaths, while the North Vietnamese had between 2,000 to 3,000 casualties. Now, even so, both sides viewed the battle as a success, America because of the high number of Vietnamese casualties, and the North Vietnamese because they had managed to hold their position. Now, after the battle, however, the commander of the Vietnamese forces, General Giap, realized that an alternative strategy was needed to overcome the military superiority of the US forces. Now, therefore, this battle also exposed the strengths and weaknesses of both sides, and these are what we're going to look at now. So first of all, if we start with the US strengths, now the US had significant economic might behind them, and this meant that they were able to have the most modern equipment in plentiful supply. Now, this also meant that the whole of South Vietnam was constructed with helicopter landing pads, and by 1967, 1 million tons of supplies were arriving in South Vietnam each month. Now, the helicopter was another crucial component to the US armory. The helicopter had the ability to recover troops, deliver troops, and to attack the enemy. Now, this economic advantage led to an approach under Westmoreland based on attrition, and this was pounding away at the enemy until victory. But one of the campaigns was the bombing, and the Americans started their bombing campaign with Operation Rolling Thunder, which we looked at last video. And the objective of this bombing campaign was to destroy the economy of North Vietnam and get rid of their resources. And this objective failed because North Vietnam was a largely agrarian country with only a few well-concealed military bases. The US efforts were also undermined because the North Vietnamese lost resources were always replaced through aid from China and the USSR. Now, the other use of air attacks was to undermine the Viet Cong in the south, and this was attempted by Operation Ranch Hand, which was approved by Kennedy as early as 1962. And Operation Ranch Hand involved spraying chemicals such as Agent Orange into the jungles to defoliate them and remove their cover. Agent Blue was also used to spray crops and deprive the enemy of food, and this had the adverse effect of further alienating Vietnamese peasants. And many civilians were also victims to both napalm, which set people on fire, and pineapple bombs, which sprayed pellets after exploding. The other method used by the US was search and destroy, and this strategy consisted of entering villages suspected of harbouring Viet Cong and killing many of the villagers. Now, this resulted in a high number of innocent civilian deaths, and it undermined the idea of capturing the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese population. And this was a primary tactic used by the US from 65 to 68, and its success was measured on body count, obviously leading to a lot of innocent deaths. But the US weaknesses far outweighed their strengths, and this was partly due to the uselessness of the American ally, as the South Vietnamese were largely uncommitted to the fighting and they were largely untrained. The US were also further weakened by the extensive coverage of the war domestically, as images of the brutalization of many Vietnamese heightened the anti-war feeling within the US, and it was also undermining the social reform in the US and the great society that Johnson was dedicated to create. Now, this opposition severely damaged Johnson's war efforts. Now, if we look at the North Vietnamese strengths, as unlike the US forces, the Vietnamese were familiar with the country that they were fighting in. They were also aided by both China and the USSR, and in December 1964, China agreed to provide military supplies to North Vietnam, where they supplied 80,000 guns, and the USSR supplied surface-to-air missiles, MiG-21 jets, and artillery systems. Now, finally, their troops were also determined to win the battle, and their tactics were ingenious. So one thing they did have was peasant support, as northern forces were based on the Viet Cong and the regular North Vietnamese army, and the Viet Cong were able to gain support from the peasant population. And this was partly because they based their principles on Mao in China, and this stated that one should not destroy crops or land, everybody should keep their word, the peasant should always be shown respect and given support. Now, the Viet Cong did also use some terror and violence against peasants who threatened them, and this blend of being violent but also being nice to the peasants did mean that they got the support that they needed. Now, the guerrilla tactics were also hugely successful, and because the North Vietnamese were unable to commit to conventional warfare, they used their style of sophisticated guerrilla tactics. And these included complex tunnel systems to hide Viet Cong troops, and booby traps were used in the dense forest like grenades or small groups to ambush US forces, and these were a constant worry for the US troops. Now, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was also a path passing through both Cambodia and Laos, and it was the main supply line for both soldiers and equipment, and it was vital for the logistics of the war, and although the US regularly targeted it, they never managed to fully disable it. So these three things were the main reason for the North Vietnamese success. However, there was a couple of weaknesses, and one was that the high degree of dependency on both the USSR and China, and without them the North's economy wouldn't be able to sustain a prolonged war. There was also no guaranteed support among the South Vietnamese peasants, and this was shown because the planned uprising during the Tet Offensive never materialized. But as we can see, the strength of the North Vietnamese was far superior to the strength of the American army, and that was one reason why they ended up winning the war. So thank you and see you soon. Bye.